This new brief warns that the world needs to act with urgency to support countries affected by the crisis, one that will leave deep and long-lasting scars, producing alarming cascading effects to a world economy already battered by COVID-19.
The war is supercharging a three-dimensional crisis: food, energy and finance, that is pummeling some of the world's most vulnerable people, countries and economies. And all this comes at a time when developing countries are already struggling with a slate of challenges not of their making: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the lack of access to adequate resources to finance the recovery in the context of persistent and growing inequalities. We are now facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of many developing countries.
The brief points to 107 economies severely exposed to at least one dimension of the shock, calling on countries to engage more robustly in multilateral fora in an effort towards collective action, that solutions be based on global and not solely on individual country-based risk, for international financial mechanisms to be exhausted to expand the fiscal space in countries with high debt burdens, and for the private, civil society and philanthropic sectors to support the most vulnerable.
The international financial system has deep pockets. I've been strongly advocating for its reform, but developing countries need help now, and the funds are there. So we need to make them available to economies that need them most, so that governments can avoid default, provide social safety nets for the poorest and most vulnerable, and continue to make critical investments in sustainable development. This is not a crisis that can be solved piecemeal, country by country. This global and systemic emergency requires global and systemic solutions.
We have to prevent another lost decade for developing countries. So we need to enact immediately in the international financial system, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, to do everything possible to ensure more liquidity to the countries, making use of the already windows that they have for fast disbursement, for emergency.
Let's talk particularly about sub-Saharan Africa.
We press them on the implications for sub-Saharan Africa, where the impacts of the war in Ukraine are merely adding to the burden of COVID-19, staggeringly high youth unemployment, political instability and climate shocks, to mention a few.
Given the context that we see there, it's more than just the conflicts, it's also the climate crisis. So this multitude of crises that are happening in the region, this report gives us, again, the solutions to acting now with the instruments that we have. Otherwise, there will be even more instability. There will be even more crisis as we see it, and that crisis will go beyond borders.
The risks for the African continent and for peace and stability in the African continent, beyond the risks for hunger and poverty of the African people, are now extraordinarily expanded.
And while this brief is about cushioning the blow of the war globally, the UN position remains one that above all, the war must end, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the billions of people who lie in the path of its destructive consequences. Sherwin Bryceby's SABC News, New York.